great pleasure to introduce Lisa Archibald, who is from Intentional Peer Support, to talk about a very important topic, which is how to establish mutual relationships and to negotiate power. Over to you, Lisa.
I suppose I want to start by saying I think that there's a lot that we can learn in co-production from peer support in terms of when peer support is done well. The beautiful thing that it brings is this space where we can actually be mutual and reciprocal, and we can talk about power and we can name and share power. And I think some of the learnings for me in terms of the peer support model actually I think is quite translatable. And I think the first thing I want to say is the intentionality is what's important for me, because I think co-production has to be intentional. It's not a passive process. It's something that we have to be thinking intentionally, because we're entering into a relationship. And so when we enter into a relationship, we do it with intentionality, and we have to actually consider, why are we here and what is our purpose and what are we hoping to achieve from this? I'm going to start. This is Sherry Maid, who created intentional peer support, and it was kind of born out of the psychiatric survivor movement. And I suppose I see myself as I'm part of a movement. I'm a master's study student in MAD studies, and I see myself as somebody who is part of a movement rather than being a person that does this as a job. So for me, my intention is always around social change. And I think co-production, we should be considering some of those aspects as what are we hoping to achieve as an outcome. And I'm glad that we've already started to talk about that today. So I like this quote because it actually does talk about the negotiation of power and how we can do that through coming with the experiences that we tell, and that actually both people can have power, and that we don't necessarily need to see power as always a terrible thing. I think sometimes when we talk about power, we can jump into being defensive and saying, I don't have power, or I need this power, or I've earned that power, rather than actually thinking, where can power be utilised in a way that might feel more positive rather than it feeling negative? And we use power a lot in campaigning and activism, and so it's something that when it's named, negotiated and shared can actually be a really powerful tool and something that we can do to bring about really intentional and purposeful change. And so what's important for me and what I'm going to talk about as I work through this wee presentation is thinking about how the tasks and principles of intentional peer support might be helpful when we're looking at co-production. So this is a real simple visual of the intentional peer support framework, which is basically the important thing that we have these three principles, and we think that when these principles are put into practice, that actually you can have intentional relationships. So traditionally, what we do know within spaces where we are engaging with the mental health systems and with services is that we have quite a traditional helper-helpee dynamic. And what can be intentional and actually super helpful in terms of when we enter into relationships, particularly in co-production, is actually how do we come as fellow learners? How do we be open to learning from each other? So when I'm there, even though I may be there as someone who identifies as having a lived experience, or maybe that's what people have invited me for, is actually I also want to learn from others who are there, because their experiences will be different from mine. And I'm also interested in learning from clinicians to understand, well, why are you here and what brought you here and what's your perspective? So I think it's not just that passive process of I'm here to tell you about my experiences, but actually I'm also here because I want to learn from you. And I'd like to think that other people who enter into those co-production relationships want to learn about my experience, but also want to tell me about theirs. And so helping to learning is the first principle. The second one is about moving from seeing ourselves as just individuals who are contributing to a process, and instead to thinking about us entering into a relationship. And I've heard people talking earlier about the fact that when it goes well, we're actually talking about being in partnership. And to me, a partnership is a relationship, and we want to be thinking, what do we need to do to nurture and nourish those relationships that we're entering into? And I loved the first presentation where Keir was talking about actually, over food or, going out for coffee and those kind of things, because we want to get to know who we are as people. And that's a really important thing about being in relationship. And the third principle is moving from fear to hope and possibility. And I think that's a really important one when we're talking about anything that's to do with systems and services, is that often people can come from quite a fear-based perspective, and it can be helpful to be focusing on acknowledging and naming that there's some fear there, and it's okay to feel fear, but actually how do we shift the conversations to being about what's possible? Otherwise we can get a bit stuck. And then there's these 4 tasks, which I'll go into in a wee while, which are how we do this, how we put these principles into practice. So the second principle is this idea that we're not just individuals doing a thing, we're actually entering into a relationship. Because when we come from a position of being individualistic, we can get stuck in this idea that maybe only one of us needs to share, maybe only one of us needs to change as a result of the interaction. Some of the outcomes can be predetermined, and I think we see that a lot in co-production processes, is the fact that people might come from an individual perspective and have all these ideas of, well, this is what we're going to do, and already have decided on the end result without actually going through the process first. And so conversations can be individualistic. And then we stop co-learning, and we can get into those dynamics where one party will hold the power, and that's usually the party that's already predetermined the outcomes. And so if we're thinking relationally, the idea is that when we enter into this co-production relationship, as a result of what we're learning from each other, we're both going to change and grow, or we're all going to change and grow if that's a big group of us, because we're coming in as learners, and we're coming in with the intention of changing and growing, that we're not going to stay the same. We actually want to be and do something different. We want to have our eyes opened to other people's perspectives. And in order to do that, we actually are coming from a place of curiosity and being honest and open. And that can be even being honest and open around the disconnections, around the discomfort, because we're also having to tolerate the fact that we're all seeing things differently. And we need to be open to the fact that there's not one truth and there's not one perspective, and that can be challenging at times. And so we think about being in partnership from the outset. So not halfway down the line, or not once we've already decided what we're going to do, but actually from the start is saying, okay, we're in partnership, and being open to not actually knowing where it's going to go. And that is the discomfort element. And I'm going to talk a wee bit about power being named and shared, but when we're being relational, we actually start to get into that process of doing it. But when people open up the space where we start to talk about, well, what could be different? What's possible? What did you learn? Now that shifts my energy, and I know that I find that really helpful, because it unsticks me from just the vortex of negativity where I'm thinking about all the times the services that have not worked, all the times where I felt like the care hasn't been helpful. But actually I start to think about, if I was running that service, this is what I would want to do. And so we can move towards conversations where we start to think about new possibilities, and it starts to feel more exciting, and it starts to feel more hopeful, because I'm actually thinking, okay, there's a purpose to this. Even if I had this really traumatic experience of this thing, there's still a learning that can come out of it, because I can actually channel some of that energy towards seeing if things could be different for other people having an experience in the future. And I think some of those fear-based relationships, some of the fears that start to come in can be in co-production, is when I start to see that who holds the agenda, who decides on how the decisions are being made, who decides on the priorities, how much information are we willing to share. And sometimes people will feel fearful of handing over too much power or control at the start, or too much information, in fear of suddenly it's not going your way anymore, and you've kind of like, it's like an open season, and you're like, oh, but this is not what I had in mind. And you start to feel uncomfortable because it's maybe going in a direction that wasn't your intention. And I think what's important is for us to be able to have conversations around that, is to not pretend that it doesn't happen, but actually to be able to talk about, when I talk about, actually, this is not what I had hoped for, or this is not what I thought was coming, and to be able to tolerate that as a group. So mutuality is this idea that if it's not working for both people, it's not working. And often the time that we realize this in a co-production space is when people no longer want to be part of it. And again, that comes back to the fact that maybe the foundations have not been laid first. The connection hasn't been in place. We haven't taken time to actually get to know each other and understand each other's worldview. We haven't talked about which language do we want to use. Do we use your language, my language? Do we start to create our own language? And so we can get to this point where the time that we know that there isn't mutuality is when the relationship actually ends. And thinking about how do we have conversations from the start? Like, what will it look like for you when it's working? What will it look like for you when it's not working? And how do we start our relationship by having those conversations so that when things get clunky and when things are difficult, we can come from a place of curiosity and we can actually start to have that rich dialogue again around reconnecting. And what does that mean for each of us? So the reality is that we know that power can often be abused, but it can also be shared. And as I said at the start, is thinking we often get uncomfortable with power because we see it only as a bad thing. But actually, there are lots of spaces where when power is negotiated and used for good, like a superpower, that actually can be something that can bring about quite purposeful and intentional social change. And I'm thinking about even within other movements, is actually thinking about some of the movements in terms of when power has been shared and negotiated with people who have been marginalized, oppressed, then we've actually seen that people have actually been able to regain some power and be able to gain some traction and make some significant changes. And in order for that to be possible, those of us that hold power need to be willing to give some of it away and be open to the fact that we're naming that we've actually got it in the first place. And it's important to be not trying to desire the unrealistic. Like, it's never going to be a level playing field because life isn't that simple. But what we can do is say that what we're looking at is naming some of the inequalities that we know exist, and they happen deeply entrenched in the mental health system. I mean, they talk about mental health like no other type of health, and that people don't necessarily always want the treatment that they're given, don't necessarily have the choice to decline a treatment. So there's lots of spaces where power has been abused in the mental health service. So we need to be willing to talk about that, is to say, okay, this is a more difficult health space than any other because of some of those power imbalances. And so we need to be putting strategies in place that will help negate some of the wrongdoing. So I want to share this quote, and then I'm open to having a discussion or whatever feels helpful, and ejecting the cat as I go, which comes from Sherry Mead. And I think it's a really important one, is to think about, often why we're doing this, any of us actually, is this about our intention being social change. So it's not just about developing effective services. I mean, yes, that might be something that comes as an outcome too, but actually it's about creating dialogues that influence on all of our understandings, conversations, and relationships. Because when we can bridge some of this and actually be in dialogue, be in relationship, and work together, we actually start to then tackle some of the discriminatory attitudes, some of the inequalities and adversity that people are facing. I mean, I think there's also a helpful question around when we're in some of these co-production spaces, is thinking about who's also missing. Like, if this is about genuine social change, it's not just about, well, we're here and we're doing this, but actually, is there people of color? Are there people who come from the LGBTQ plus community? Like, how do we make sure that the people who are in the co-production process are also representative of some of the people that experience the most marginalisation and oppression within systems and services. And for me, there's also something around how do we, when it feels like quite a white-centric process, how do we hold space for other people to be part of that too? And I suppose I'm just chucking that in because I think it's an important reminder around, do we often get asked to be at things because we're more palatable than other folks? I don't know. And who gets the seat at the table, I think, is an important part of the dialogue.